I should have stopped her. It's not your job to stop her. I'd stood up, smoothing down my dress. It's mine. The drive home had been quiet. Marcus had tried a few times to start a conversation, but I wasn't ready to talk yet. I was still processing what had happened, still trying to understand how Vivian had managed to take something so private, so sacred, and turn it into dinner party gossip. By the time we'd pulled into our driveway, I'd made a decision. Not a heated, emotional choice born from anger, but a calm, calculated resolve that settled in my chest like a weight I was finally ready to carry. Vivian had spent years treating my life like her personal entertainment. She'd shared details about my marriage, my career struggles, my family relationships. She'd made jokes about my weight, my cooking, my inability to keep plants alive. She'd turned every family gathering into an opportunity to highlight my shortcomings while positioning herself as the successful, together sister-in-law who had it all figured out. But this was different. This crossed every line of human decency. And if Vivian thought she could use my deepest pain as her conversation starter, then maybe it was time she learned what it felt like to have her private life become public knowledge. I'd spent years protecting her secrets, covering for her mistakes, making excuses for her behavior. I'd been the good sister-in-law, the one who kept family peace at any cost. But that night, sitting in my car with the taste of betrayal still bitter in my mouth, I'd realized something important. Sometimes keeping the peace means declaring war. The next morning, I'd woken up with the same calm determination I'd felt the night before. Marcus had already left for work, leaving a note on the kitchen counter about calling him if I needed anything. Sweet, protective Marcus, who still believed that family problems could be solved with honest conversations and good intentions. I'd made coffee, checked my email, and then opened the contact list on my phone. Dr. Peterson's office was still there, along with several others. Vivian's gynecologist, her therapist, her dermatologist, even her psychiatrist from 2 years ago when she'd gone through what she'd called her experimental phase with anxiety medication. For years, I'd been her emergency contact, her insurance beneficiary, her medical power of attorney. She'd never bothered to update any of it, probably because it was easier to leave things as they were than to find someone else willing to deal with her drama. But I'd kept careful records. I'd always been organized that way. The type of person who saved important documents and filed away medical records, including Vivian's. I'd pulled out the manila folder from my filing cabinet, the one labeled Family Medical in my neat handwriting. Inside were years of documents Vivian had asked me to keep safe. Test results, prescriptions, insurance claims, all the private details of a life she'd never expected me to have access to. As I spread the papers across my kitchen table, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years when it came to Vivian. Control. For once, I held all the cards. For once, I had something she wouldn't want shared with the world. And that's when I'd started planning exactly how to give her a taste of her own medicine. The medical files told a story Vivian had never intended anyone to read. As I sat at my kitchen table the next morning, sorting through years of documents she'd entrusted to me, patterns began emerging that made my stomach turn. It wasn't just the dinner party. It had never been just isolated incidents. 3 years ago, Vivian had been diagnosed with chronic anxiety disorder. The prescription records showed monthly refills for Xanax, Lexapro, and something called Abilify that I had to look up online. Bipolar disorder, the search results told me. The same condition she'd mocked our cousin Rachel for having just last Christmas, calling her unstable and dramatic when Rachel had excused herself from family dinner early. But that wasn't the worst discovery. Tucked between insurance claims and lab results was a letter from her therapist, Dr. Morgan Walsh. It was marked confidential and dated 6 months ago, right around the time Vivian had started her new job. The letter was addressed to her supervisor, explaining her need for workplace accommodations due to severe interpersonal difficulties and narcissistic behavioral patterns that impact professional relationships. I read it twice before the implications sunk in. Vivian had been mandated to therapy by her employer. The promotion she'd celebrated with such fanfare wasn't a recognition of her excellence, it was damage control. They'd moved her to a department where she'd have less contact with clients after multiple complaints about her conduct. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "How are you feeling today? Want me to come home for lunch?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I kept reading. There were dermatology records showing extensive treatments for stress-related skin conditions, gynecology reports documenting 3 separate pregnancy scares over the past 2 years, none of which she'd mentioned to anyone in the family. And buried deep in the pile, a psychiatric evaluation from 18 months ago that made my blood run cold. Patient exhibits classic symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder with comorbid antisocial tendencies. Demonstrated pattern of exploiting personal relationships for emotional regulation. Shows marked inability to empathize with others' emotional states. Recommend long-term cognitive behavioral therapy and continued medication management. I set the paper down with shaking hands. Antisocial tendencies? Exploiting personal relationships? The words felt like puzzle pieces clicking into place, explaining years of interactions I'd dismissed as thoughtlessness or social awkwardness. Like the time Vivian had announced my fertility struggles to Marcus's entire extended family at his grandmother's funeral reception. I was mortified, standing there in my black dress while elderly relatives patted my arm and offered unsolicited advice about relaxation techniques and alternative medicine. Vivian had claimed later that she'd been trying to get me emotional support, that she didn't realize I wanted to keep it private. Or when she'd shared details about Marcus's brief unemployment during the recession, turning our temporary financial stress into a cautionary tale she'd tell at parties. Poor Marcus just couldn't find anything in his field. She had to carry them financially for almost a year. It was really hard on their marriage. The truth was, Marcus had been unemployed for 6 weeks and had found an even better position. But Vivian's version made for a more dramatic story. I'd always attributed her behavior to social clumsiness, maybe a touch of self-centeredness. I'd made excuses. "She doesn't mean any harm," I'd tell Marcus when he'd get frustrated with her oversharing. "She just doesn't think before she speaks." But the medical records painted a different picture. This wasn't accidental. This was calculated. Vivian had been systematically collecting and redistributing the private details of our lives because it served a psychological need. Our pain was her entertainment. Our struggles were her social currency. My laptop was still open from the night before, and I found myself scrolling through Vivian's social media accounts with new eyes. Her Instagram was a carefully curated collection of success stories and humble brags. Photos of expensive dinners with captions about treating herself after a hard week. Pictures of her newly renovated bathroom with comments about finally getting the self-care space I deserve. But looking closer, I noticed something else. In almost every post, she'd tagged someone else's tragedy or struggle in the comments. Under a picture of her new handbag, she'd written, "Retail therapy after hearing about Sarah's divorce. Sending love to anyone going through relationship struggles right now." Under a picture of her weekend spa day, "Much needed relaxation after helping my sister-in-law through her recent loss. It's so important to prioritize mental health." She was monetizing our pain, literally building her personal brand on other people's suffering, positioning herself as the caring friend who was always there during difficult times. The sister-in-law who understood struggle because she was so close to it, so involved in supporting others through their darkest moments. I scrolled further back, looking for patterns. There it was, from 3 months ago. A post about supporting loved ones through pregnancy loss, with a caption about the importance of holding space for grief. Posted 2 days after I'd told her about the miscarriage. Posted before I'd even told my own mother. The comments were exactly what you'd expect. "You're such a caring person. Your family is so lucky to have you. This is why I love following you. You're so real about life's challenges." Except none of it was real.
None of it was her life, her challenges, her experiences. She was a parasite, feeding off genuine human suffering and transforming it into social media content that made her look compassionate and wise. I clicked on her Facebook page and found more of the same. Status updates about being there for family during difficult medical situations. Photos from charity events for infertility awareness that she'd attended after learning about our struggles. She'd even joined an online support group for pregnancy loss, not because she'd experienced it herself, but because proximity to that pain gave her material for her performance of empathy. The worst part was how good she was at it, how convincing her concern always seemed in the moment. When I'd called her crying the day we found out we'd lost the baby, she'd said all the right things. She'd brought me tea and tissues. She'd sat with me while Marcus was at work and let me talk through my fears about whether I'd ever be able to carry a pregnancy to term. I'd been grateful for her support. I'd felt closer to her than I had in years. And the entire time, she'd been taking mental notes for her next social media post, her next conversation starter, her next opportunity to position herself as the caring sister-in-law who really understood what I was going through. My phone rang, jolting me out of my research spiral. Vivian's name flashed on the screen. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity won. "Hey, Sophia!" Her voice was bright, cheerful, completely normal. "I just wanted to check on you after last night. You seemed a little upset when you left." A little upset. As if I'd had a minor disagreement about the weather instead of having my most private tragedy announced to a room full of strangers. "I'm fine," I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. "Good, good. I was worried I might have said something wrong. You know how I am. Sometimes I just talk too much when I'm nervous about work things." She laughed, that practiced sound she made when she wanted to deflect responsibility. "I hope you know I was just trying to help people understand why you seemed a little off last night. I thought it might be good for you to have some support." Help people understand why I seemed off? As if my grief was a social inconvenience that needed explaining. Actually, Vivian, I wanted to talk to you about that. I kept my voice calm, controlled. About sharing personal information. "Oh, that. Listen, I'm sorry if I overstepped. I just think it's healthy to talk about these things, you know? There's too much stigma around pregnancy loss. Women need to know they're not alone." She was doing it again. Taking my specific pain and turning it into a general cause. Making herself the advocate for women everywhere, while completely ignoring the fact that she'd violated my privacy without permission. "The thing is," I continued, "I'm not comfortable with my medical information being discussed at social gatherings." "Medical information? Sophia, it wasn't medical information. It was just a conversation about life experiences. I was being supportive." The gaslighting was so smooth, so automatic, that I almost doubted my own memory of the night before. Almost. "You mentioned specific details about my pregnancy, the timing of the miscarriage, and medical opinions about genetic issues." Silence on the other end. Then, "I was just trying to help people understand." Understand what, exactly? That these things happen for a reason. That maybe it wasn't such a terrible thing after all. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. She genuinely believed that my trauma was a teaching opportunity, that my loss was a conversation piece that could help others gain perspective on their own lives. "I need to go," I said quietly. "Wait, Sophia, don't be like this. I can tell you're upset, but I really don't think I did anything wrong. I was just being honest about family situations. It's not like I made anything up." Being honest about family situations. As if honesty was the same thing as consent. As if her right to discuss my life superseded my right to privacy. "I'll talk to you later, Vivian." "Sophia, come on! Don't make this into a bigger deal than it needs to be. You're being really sensitive about this." I hung up without responding. My hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't from hurt. It was from rage. Pure, Clean anger that felt like clarity after months of confusion and self-doubt. She wasn't going to apologize. She wasn't going to acknowledge what she'd done wrong. She was going to continue painting me as the oversensitive sister-in-law who couldn't handle normal conversation about life experiences. But now I had her medical records spread across my kitchen table. Now I knew about the bipolar diagnosis she'd hidden from everyone, the anxiety medication she'd mocked others for needing, the workplace complaints that had forced her into therapy, the psychiatric evaluation that confirmed what I suspected but never had words for. Vivian had built her entire social persona on being the successful, together family member who helped others through their struggles. She positioned herself as mentally healthy, emotionally stable, personally and professionally accomplished. She used that image to justify her invasive behavior, to make herself the expert on other people's lives. But it was all performance. Behind the confident exterior was someone so psychologically unstable that her own employer had mandated professional intervention. Someone whose mental health was so fragile that she needed daily medication to function. Someone whose personality disorders were severe enough to require ongoing psychiatric care. I gathered the papers into neat stacks, organizing them by date and type. Vivian had taught me something valuable over the years. She'd shown me that personal information was power, that private struggles could be weaponized, that someone's deepest vulnerabilities could be turned into social currency. She'd been such a good teacher, and I'd been such an attentive student. Tomorrow night, she was hosting another dinner party, a bigger one this time, for her birthday. She'd invited half the neighborhood, plus family, plus colleagues from work. She'd be expecting me to show up with a smile and pretend nothing had happened, ready to provide fresh material for her next performance of caring sisterhood. I was definitely planning to attend, but this time I'd be bringing my own conversation starters. The burgundy folder sat in my passenger seat like a loaded weapon as I drove to Vivian's birthday party. I'd organized everything meticulously, copies of the most revealing documents paper-clipped together in chronological order.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The psychiatric evaluation on top, followed by the workplace complaints, then the medication records, and finally the therapy notes about her narcissistic personality disorder. Marcus had tried one last time to talk me out of it as I'd gotten dressed that evening. Maybe we could just skip tonight, he'd suggested, watching me apply lipstick with steady hands. Say you're still not feeling well. I'm feeling better than I have in months, I'd replied, and meant it. The calm that had settled over me since discovering Vivian's secrets felt unshakable. This wasn't about anger anymore. This was about balance. The party was already in full swing when I arrived. Vivian's house blazed with warm light, laughter spilling out onto the front porch where clusters of guests mingled with wine glasses and appetizer plates. I recognized most of the faces from her social media posts. Colleagues from the marketing firm, neighbors from her street, a few distant relatives she kept around for occasions like this. "Sophia!" Vivian's voice carried across the foyer as I entered. She was wearing an emerald green dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, her smile bright and welcoming. "I'm so glad you came. I wasn't sure if you'd make it after our conversation yesterday." She air-kissed both my cheeks, a gesture she'd picked up during her brief phase of dating a French photographer. Her perfume was expensive and overwhelming, like everything else about her carefully constructed image. "I wouldn't miss your birthday," I said, matching her bright tone. 36 is such a milestone. A flicker of irritation crossed her face. Vivian had been telling people she was 34 for the past 3 years, but her medical records had her real birth date clearly documented. Small details like that mattered when you were planning to dismantle someone's facade. "Let me introduce you to some people," she said, linking her arm through mine with false intimacy. "There are some fascinating individuals here tonight." The next hour passed in polite conversation and careful observation. I watched Vivian work the room with practiced efficiency, collecting compliments and dispensing just enough personal information about other people to keep conversations interesting. She mentioned her neighbor's recent job loss while discussing the local economy. She referenced her colleague's divorce when someone brought up relationship challenges. She was a master at turning other people's private struggles into her own social currency. I waited until dinner was served and everyone was seated around her expanded dining table. The same white table where she'd shattered my privacy just 2 nights earlier, the same chairs where 23 people had listened to her broadcast my most painful experience for their entertainment. Vivian was in her element, holding court at the head of the table with a glass of expensive wine and a captive audience. She'd just finished telling a story about her recent promotion, carefully omitting the details about workplace complaints and mandatory therapy. "I have to say," announced Janet from accounting, raising her glass, "working with Vivian has been such an inspiration. She brings such emotional intelligence to everything she does." "Hear, hear," added someone from the neighborhood association. "You're always so thoughtful about what other people are going through." That's when I stood up. The conversation gradually died as chairs turned in my direction. Vivian looked puzzled but pleased, probably assuming I was about to make some sort of birthday toast. "I wanted to share something with everyone," I began, my voice carrying clearly across the room. "Since we're talking about emotional intelligence and being thoughtful about what people are going through." I pulled the burgundy folder from my purse and set it on the table. Vivian has taught me so much about sharing personal information in social settings, about how transparency can really help people understand each other better. Vivian's smile faltered slightly. "Sophia, what are you doing?" "Just following your example," I said, opening the folder. 2 nights ago, at this very table, Vivian shared some very personal medical information about me with all of you. She told you about my recent miscarriage, gave you details about the timing and circumstances, even shared her thoughts about genetic issues and natural selection. The room had gone completely silent. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Someone set down their wine glass with an audible clink. "She said it was important to be open about these things," I continued, pulling out the first document. "That there's too much stigma around personal struggles, that sharing helps people feel less alone." "Sophia, stop!" Vivian's voice had lost all its party hostess warmth. "So in that spirit of openness," I said, holding up the psychiatric evaluation, "I thought you'd all be interested to know about Vivian's own medical journey. For instance, did you know she was diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder 18 months ago?" A collective intake of breath rippled around the table. Vivian went pale, her hand clutching her wineglass so tightly I thought it might shatter. "The evaluation is quite detailed," I continued, scanning the document as if I were reading from a recipe card. "It mentions antisocial tendencies, inability to empathize with others, and a pattern of exploiting personal relationships for emotional regulation. Fascinating stuff, really." "You can't do this," Vivian whispered, but her voice carried in the stunned silence. "Why not? You said transparency was healthy. You said there's too much stigma around these things." I pulled out the next document. "Oh, and here's something interesting. Those workplace complaints that led to your recent department transfer. Apparently, multiple clients reported feeling manipulated and emotionally exploited during their interactions with you." Janet from accounting was staring at her plate, her face flushed with secondhand embarrassment. The neighborhood praised Vivian's thoughtfulness, was looking around the room as if searching for an exit. "Your therapist notes are particularly illuminating." I unfolded another paper. "Dr. Walsh writes that you show marked difficulty distinguishing between your own experiences and those of others, that you tend to appropriate other people's trauma as source material for your own narratives." "Stop it," Vivian hissed. "Those are private medical records." "Are they?" I tilted my head with mock confusion. But I'm your emergency contact. I'm listed on all your insurance forms. You gave me access to these documents years ago, remember? You said families should know about important medical information. The irony wasn't lost on anyone at the table. Vivian had made me her medical proxy during her divorce, when she'd needed someone reliable to handle her affairs. She'd never bothered to change the designation, probably because it was easier to leave things as they were. Besides, I added, setting the papers down carefully, according to your own philosophy, this kind of sharing helps people understand why you might seem a little off sometimes. Like how you've been taking anti-anxiety medication for 3 years while giving advice to others about managing stress naturally? I pulled out the prescription records. Xanax, Lexapro, and something called Ambalife for bipolar disorder. The same condition you mocked our cousin Rachel for having, remember? When you called her unstable and dramatic? The silence was deafening. People were staring at their plates, at the walls, anywhere but at Vivian or me. The social dynamics in the room had shifted completely. The confident, successful woman who had been holding court 5 minutes earlier now looked exactly like what she was. Someone whose carefully constructed image was crumbling in real time. You know what the most interesting part is? I said, my voice conversational, almost friendly. All those social media posts about supporting loved ones through difficult times, all those charity events for causes you've never personally experienced, all that performance of empathy and understanding. I gestured to the documents spread across her white tablecloth like evidence at a trial. None of it was real.
You've been using other people's genuine pain as content for your personal brand. You've turned family trauma into social media engagement. You've monetized human suffering and called it compassion. Vivian was crying now, but they weren't the manipulative tears she usually deployed when she needed sympathy. These were the tears of someone whose mask had been ripped away in front of an audience. The psychiatric evaluation mentioned something called emotional vampirism, I continued, consulting the papers again. Apparently, it's when someone feeds off other people's emotional experiences because they can't generate authentic feelings of their own. They become addicted to the drama, the attention, the sense of importance that comes from being adjacent to real human experience. I looked directly at Vivian for the first time since I'd started speaking. Her perfectly applied makeup was streaking down her cheeks, her hands shaking as she reached for her wine glass. "So thank you, Vivian," I said, gathering the documents back into the folder. "Thank you for teaching me that personal information is powerful, that private struggles can be shared without consent, that someone's deepest vulnerabilities make excellent conversation starters." I stood up, smoothing down my dress. "Thank you for showing me that family means never having to ask permission before broadcasting someone's medical history to a room full of strangers." The guests were beginning to murmur among themselves, the spell of silence finally breaking. I could hear fragments of whispered conversations, people processing what they'd just witnessed. "I should probably mention," I added, pausing at the dining room entrance, "that Vivian's birthday isn't actually today. According to her medical records, she was born 3 years earlier than she's been telling people. Just another little performance, another small deception in service of the image she's been so carefully cultivating." I walked out of that house the same way I'd walked out 2 nights earlier, with dignity and purpose. But this time, I wasn't the victim. This time, I wasn't the one whose privacy had been violated for someone else's entertainment. Behind me, I could hear Vivian's voice, high and desperate, trying to explain, trying to minimize, trying to regain control of a narrative that was no longer hers to shape. But her guests were already standing, already making their excuses, already reaching for coats and purses. In my car, I sat for a moment before starting the engine. My hands were steady, my breathing calm. I had expected to feel guilty, or at least conflicted, about what I'd just done. Instead, I felt lighter than I had in years. Marcus was waiting when I got home, sitting on our couch with a cup of tea and a worried expression. "How did it go?" he asked quietly. "I think Vivian learned something valuable tonight, about the importance of keeping private medical information private." He didn't ask for details. He didn't need to.
The relief on my face probably told him everything he needed to know. My phone buzzed with texts throughout the evening, some from people who'd been at the party expressing shock and support, a few from family members who'd heard what happened through the inevitable gossip network, even one from Janet at accounting, apologizing for not speaking up 2 nights earlier. But nothing from Vivian. And for the first time in years, the silence felt perfect. 3 months later, I heard through mutual acquaintances that Vivian had moved to another city. A fresh start, they said. New job, new apartment, new social circle. People who didn't know about her medical history or her previous reputation. I hoped she'd learned something from our final dinner together. I hoped she'd found a way to build relationships based on genuine connection rather than exploiting other people's vulnerabilities. But mostly, I hoped I'd never have to see her again. Marcus and I are trying again when we're ready. This time, it's just between us. No announcements, no updates, no shared medical information with family members who might turn our hopes and fears into their entertainment. Some things are too precious to share. Some experiences are too sacred to become someone else's story. Vivian taught me that lesson, even if she never intended to. And for that education, despite everything, I suppose I should be grateful. 6 months passed without a word from Vivian, and I discovered what peace actually felt like. No more walking on eggshells at family gatherings, wondering what private details she'd weaponize next. No more screening my conversations, calculating what information was safe to share. No more bracing myself for the inevitable moment when my personal struggles would become her public performance. Marcus got a promotion at work, and we kept the news to ourselves for weeks before telling anyone. It felt revolutionary having something good happen without immediately worrying about how it would be twisted or diminished or turned into someone else's story about their own career aspirations. I ran into Janet from Vivian's old accounting department at the grocery store in March. She approached me hesitantly, clearly unsure whether to acknowledge what had happened at the birthday party. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. I should have said something that night at the first dinner party. What she did was completely inappropriate. "You didn't know me well enough to intervene," I replied, and meant it. "But thank you for saying that." "For what it's worth," Janet continued, "the whole office atmosphere changed after she left. People seem more relaxed, more willing to share actual thoughts instead of walking on eggshells. We didn't realize how much stress she was creating until it was gone." That conversation stayed with me for days. The idea that Vivian's absence could create space for other people to breathe, to be authentic, to exist without performing for her consumption. How many relationships had she poisoned with her need to feed off other people's experiences? In April, Marcus and I found out we were expecting again. This time, we made different choices. We told my parents and his after the first trimester. We shared the news with a few close friends when I started showing. We kept our doctor's appointments private, our concerns between us, our joy untainted by the fear that someone would steal it and repackage it as their own story. When people ask how we were handling the pregnancy after our previous loss, I gave honest but brief answers. We're cautiously optimistic, or taking it one day at a time. I didn't provide details that could be transformed into content for someone else's narrative about resilience or healing or the mysterious ways life works out. The baby was born healthy in December, a daughter we named Claire after Marcus's grandmother. When I held her for the first time, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Vivian's reign of emotional terrorism began. Pure, uncomplicated happiness that belonged entirely to us. I thought about sending Vivian an announcement just to prove that some stories have genuinely happy endings that don't require someone else's pain as contrast. But I realized that sharing anything with her, even joy, would be missing the point entirely. Some people aren't meant to be witnesses to your life. Some relationships survive only because one person keeps sacrificing their dignity to maintain the peace. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is to stop feeding the people who consume your experiences without offering anything real in return. Claire is 6 months old now, sleeping peacefully in her crib while I write this. She'll grow up in a house where private moments stay private, where personal struggles aren't commodified, where emotional authenticity isn't performed for an audience. She'll never know her Aunt Vivian, and I'm grateful for that mercy. The medical records are still in my filing cabinet, tucked away in their burgundy folder. I keep them not as weapons, but as reminders, evidence of what I learned about boundaries, about power, about the difference between genuine connection and emotional exploitation. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to refuse to be someone's source material. Sometimes protection looks like silence. And sometimes justice is as simple as giving someone exactly what they've been giving you. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.